I'm Alan Greeley, and I love thinking and meditating on Scripture. Another word for it, which we don't use very often, is pondering. When the mother of Jesus heard the shepherds retell the vision of the angels' celebratory singing, the Scripture says Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. That alone is my goal with this podcast. I want us to treasure in our hearts what we hear from God and ponder it. It would be an honor to have you listen in and ponder with me. To God be the glory.
You have been so, so good to me.
Ponder with me the cutting reality of the betrayal of close friends. I'm going to begin reading in John 13, verse 21. We often focus on the foot washing here in John 13 and then the statements about love at the latter part. But this narrative, sandwiched in between those two, we rarely talk about in depth. But let's do that in this episode. Verse 21, John 13. After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of the disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table close to Jesus. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "What you are going to do, do quickly." Now, no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the money bag and Jesus was telling him, "Buy what we need for the feast," or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. A quick tragedy for you. In the darkened heart of medieval Scotland, beneath the howling winds and the shadowed halls of castles, a noble warrior named Macbeth stood honored and true. He was a man of valor. He was celebrated for his courage in battle. Macbeth had earned King Duncan's trust with blood and bravery. He was the very blade that kept Scotland safe. But within Macbeth, ambition was stirring. A whisper first, and then a storm. And soon that ambition would lead him down a path of betrayal that would stain his soul. He had met with 3 witches on the moor, as the story goes, and their cryptic prophecy planted a seed in Macbeth's mind. It simply said, "All hail, Macbeth! Thou shalt be king hereafter." They didn't command him to act. They didn't say what he should do, what he needed to do. They merely spoke of what could be, and yet from that moment, Macbeth could no longer rest in his present reality. The prophecy had unlocked a hunger that no crown could satisfy. And at first, Macbeth wanted to resist. His conscience was still eating at him. His conscience was still alive. King Duncan had honored him. He had loved him. He had called him worthy. Macbeth knew that the king was a good king. He knew of the king's virtues, and in a quiet moment of reflection, he wanted to turn away. But then came Lady Macbeth. Cold, determined, unflinching. She struck at his pride, calling him less than a man if he would not take what fate promised. With her chilling words and bold resolve, she lit a fuse of treachery within him. When Macbeth welcomed King Duncan into his home, it was under the mask of loyalty that they thought they shared. He fed him, he smiled at him. They were friends. And then, under the cover of night, Macbeth took his dagger and silenced the man who trusted him the most. That single act shattered every oath he had sworn, and then nightmares, they replaced honor. He was racked by guilt and paranoia. He committed other acts of violence on his friends, just in case they knew of something or suspected of something. But these only pushed his insanity further, of course, until he was a shell of himself. His treachery did not help It was the beginning of the end. Is that the story of Macbeth or the story of Judas Iscariot? I can barely tell the difference. Oh, yes, I know there are plenty of differences between the stories, but there are enough similarities to almost be haunting. A trusted friend in the cover of night betraying a king. Except this king in Scripture knew it was coming, which makes the story of Judas even worse, I think. But think of it. A trusted friend in the cover of night. Did you hear the last 4 words of the reading there in verse 30? After he had received the morsel of bread, it says that he immediately went out, and the last 4 words are, and it was night. If that sounds ominous, it's supposed to be ominous. If this were a movie, you'd hear some tragic, emotional orchestra playing in the background, and it will be in the cover of night when Judas shows back up in Jesus' presence in Gethsemane, but with an army in tow. But what I want to focus on in this lesson is that they were friends. They were dear friends. I didn't read the earlier part of John 13 where it brings up their friendship, but look at it with me now. I began reading in verse 21, but if you back up to verse 17, the scripture says, if you know these things, this is Jesus talking to the apostles, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. Now, as you read that quotation, which is from Psalm 41, he who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. At face value, you look at that and say, Alan, that doesn't sound anything like friendship. Nothing about friendship is stated. That is why we must go back and read these quotations in their original context, in their original Old Testament context, because the psalm being quoted does specify their friendship. I have 2 psalms for you in this episode. They all have to do with Judas, but of course, our real intention is not to see Judas necessarily. It's to see Jesus in the Old Testament. I want us to sit in the tragedy of it all. The tragedy of being betrayed by a dear friend. The tragedy of Jesus having to go through it. The tragedy of Jesus knowing that it was going to take place exactly as it turned out. And I want us to sit in the evidence of that too. The evidence that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That these ancient texts could speak so clearly to the betrayal of Jesus should build our faith. And that's what I want to do in this episode. Build your faith in Jesus by letting us see the tragedy of it all before Jesus was even born into the world. Psalm 41, if you want to follow along, be turning there, please. Psalm 41 is a psalm of David. You can see that in the superscription. It says, to the choir master, a psalm of David. David writes this psalm about a betrayal of a friend. I'll talk about in a moment how that relates to the life of David and who that betrayer is in the life of David. But this is where the quotation from John 13 about Judas betraying Jesus comes from. So yes, there is a David application, and we'll talk about that, but I want you to hear the story. I want you to hear the psalm and think about Jesus while we read. So we'll stop periodically just to make sure that we're hearing the life of Jesus. Just let me begin by reading one verse. I'll start in verse 5. Psalm 41, verse 5. My enemies say of me in malice, when will he die and his name perish? You can already hear the life of Jesus, can't you? The enemies of Jesus wanted Jesus out of the picture so badly, if that meant death, so be it. They wanted his death so desperately that even though they did not want him to die, they did not want him to be executed during the Passover because they feared a riot, they felt like they had to take the chance and kill him during Passover. You remember this quote? This is from Matthew 26, verses 3 through 5, just to illustrate how much they feared the people, but they took the opportunity anyway because they wanted him dead so badly. This is verses 3 through 5, Matthew 26. Then the chief priest and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." They did not want to kill him during Passover, but guess what? That's exactly what happened. Now, of course, God is pulling the strings here. We need to remember that, and I want to honor that. But I show you that verse to illustrate just how badly they wanted him dead. They feared an uproar. They feared a riot. But they still took the chance to kill him, partly because Judas presented them with the opportunity. Psalm 41 now, 6 and 7. When one comes to see me, he utters empty words, while his heart gathers iniquity. When he goes out, he tells it abroad. All who hate me whisper together about me. They imagine the worst for me. Read the last week of Jesus' life before the crucifixion. It was one trapping after another, one trap after another trap after another trap, all the whispering of how to entangle him. How are we going to do this? How are we going to do this by stealth? All the secret meetings about how to kill him. And none of it went unnoticed by Christ. He was a man on a mission. Verse 8, they say, a deadly thing is poured out on him. He will not rise again from where he lies. Ooh, isn't the irony so thick here? Listen to the words of the enemies again. He will not rise again. No doubt David is not talking about resurrection himself, but because we know that this story, this psalm, can be read from the standpoint of Jesus, you know that that can be referring to resurrection. He will not rise again. But that's exactly what happens. But now here's the quote from John 13, verse 9. Even my close friend, in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me, even my close friend. That's Judas Iscariot being described as a close friend of Jesus. That puts a different spin on the accusation that some of the enemies made earlier in his life. He's a friend of sinners. Actually, quite literally, he was. Not in the sense of how they were accusing him. They were accusing him of befriending people, whose lives were not morally acceptable. And basically, in their mind, he was accepting their sin, excusing their sin. He wasn't, of course, but a friend of sinners in the sense that he was a dear friend of Judas Iscariot. Even my close friend, in whom I trusted, who ate my bread. And John 13 calls that to our attention. The last thing that Judas does in the upper room is take a morsel of bread from Christ's hand, as if Christ was saying, here's a gift of bread, friend, a few more calories for the rest of your night. He took it from his hand, he immediately left the room, and it was the cover of night. Even my close friend has lifted his heel against me. And I want you to think about lifting your heel against someone, and the imagery of someone lifting their heel, it indicates the one that's about to be stomped on is in a very, very vulnerable position. For someone to lift their heel and about to crush it on you, you've got to be underneath that person. It's a very vulnerable spot. It's a very dangerous spot to be in. But you generally only let yourself be in the most vulnerable positions with your close friends and family. Verse 10, but you, O Lord, be gracious to me and raise me up. Again, no doubt, David does not refer to that as resurrection in his mind. But the double meaning of it all. Raise me up. Verse 11, by this I know you have delight in me. My enemy will not shout in triumph over me. Verse 12, but you have upheld me because of my integrity and set me in your presence forever. And that's exactly where Jesus is right now. In God's presence, at his right hand forever. Now, as I mentioned before, the psalm was written by David, and obviously David is writing this psalm about something in his life. Yes, it serves as a prophecy of the life of Jesus as well, But we can be sure that something in David's life caused him to write this about his own circumstance. And when you comb through the life of David looking for friends that betrayed him, the story of Judas becomes even more crystal clear. Most of you remember that his son Absalom tried to usurp David's throne. Absalom had an army formed and actually kicked David out of Jerusalem in an effort to kill his father and take his spot. And before you think, okay, maybe his son Solomon is the traitor and is the friend mentioned here in the psalm. No, I believe it's someone else that's very close to Absalom and close to David. You remember this name? Ahithophel. He was a trusted advisor to David. One might say a close friend. Ahithophel betrays David, and he goes over with Absalom, thinking to himself that Absalom's going to win this war against David. Absalom's going to come out on top, and Ahithophel, being the politician that he is, he wants to get on Absalom's good side. That's why politicians do. They kind of position themselves on the side that's going to win. So this Macbeth character, Ahithophel, betrays David, goes over to Absalom's side. And right after David and his men are kicked out of the city, Ahithophel gives the advice to Absalom, you need to strike now and strike hard, strike fast. Kick David while he's down. It was actually good military advice. Little did Absalom know, or Ahithophel know, David had a double agent on the inside. He had a true friend. He had been betrayed by one friend, Ahithophel, but he's got a true friend, a double agent on the inside. His name is Hushai. And Hushai tells Absalom, no. David and his men are experts in war. Don't go after them now. It's better to wait. And he's giving this advice to Absalom so that David will have time to run away. The best spy novels known to man actually begin in Scripture. Now, what does this all have to do with King David's Psalm 41? When Ahithophel finds out his little plan fails, he commits suicide, which is what the friend of Jesus did. So in Ahithophel, you have this Macbeth traitor, just like Judas Iscariot. And just like Judas, they were both friends of the king. And just like Judas, their plans don't end up working. And just like Judas, they both commit suicide. Listen to the typology here. They were both friends of the king, both traitors, both have their plans fail, both commit suicide. So not only do you have this psalm from David about a close friend betraying, but the stories play out very similarly. Fascinating stuff here. The Scripture is so deep and vast, so much more than we'll ever be able to realize. But turn now to Psalm 55. Psalm 55. Here is another betrayal psalm about the betrayal of a friend, may be written from the perspective of Ahithophel as well. And this one is a psalm of David. You can see that in the superscription, to the choir master with stringed instruments, a maskil of David. And just like Psalm 41, he's going to mention the enemies, ganging up on him, but then he quickly transitions to the betrayal of a friend. Read the first 6 verses with me. This is Psalm 55, 1 through 6. Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint, and I moan because of the noise of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. They drop trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling have come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Have you ever been so stressed out that you thought to yourself, I just want to be anywhere but here? I would choose any place other than the place and the situation that I am in right now, anywhere but here. And that's how David feels. If I could be anywhere else like a dove, I would leave. But it also sounds like Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, doesn't it? Wanted to be anywhere but there. But God's will be done. Skipping down now to verse 12, he's going to stop talking about the enemies And he's going to start talking about the betrayal also of a friend. For it is not just an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. If it was just an enemy, David says, that wouldn't be that big of a deal. But who else has turned their back? Look at verse 13. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. If it was just an enemy, I would take that all day long. But my dear friend, I hope you are seeing just how crushing the human betrayal of Christ would have felt like. As much as Christ was God, he was a man, turned on by a close confidant. And then he continues talking about what he had done with that friend, all the good times. Look at verse 14. We used to take sweet counsel together within God's house. We walked in the throng. In other words, Judas, we had so many good times together. We had so many good conversations, so many walks in God's house. Judas, we had so many good times. Dropping down to verse 16, but I call to God, and the Lord will save me. You know, in all these Psalms, and there are more Psalms about the betrayal of friends than just these two, but in all of these Psalms, when a friend is betraying David, you know what he does? He gives himself over to God. Every single psalm, he mentions a betrayal of sorts. David says, God, I'm yours. God, I need you. More on that thought in a moment, but just kind of tuck that in the back of your mind. Dropping down to verse 20, David continuing to talk about his companion. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant. Verse 21, his speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, but they were drawn swords. The traitor's speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, but they were like drawn swords. You know what's so fascinating about this? Drawn swords. When Judas shows up in Gethsemane, he brought an army like he meant war. He spoke all nice. Greetings, Rabbi. That's literally what he says. Greetings, Rabbi, like freshly churned farm butter. Greetings, Rabbi, softer than oil. But meanwhile, the army that was in tow, what had they brung? Swords and clubs. Jesus even asked them, what's all the weapons for? You saw me teaching every day in the temple. What made you guys think you needed weapons against me? Like I'm going to throw a haymaker or something? Like freshly churned warm butter, words softer than oil. But the army and the swords and the club, they showed something very different. And then the last part that I'll give you is the very beginning of verse 22. Psalm 55, verse 22, cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. If you are ever betrayed by a friend, if you are ever betrayed by a family member, a spouse, you've been cheated on, someone's committed adultery. I mean, think of the most stinging betrayals you can think of. If someone ever stabs you in the back, I want you to know your only hope of climbing out of the despair and the hurt is to cast the burden on the Lord. It's all you can do. The hurt stings too much to do anything different. It's all David could do. But I hope I've convinced you that these Psalms are about Jesus too. And that's what Jesus did. From Psalm 41, remember what he's doing. He's casting it on the Lord. And the betrayal of a close friend is mentioned there in Psalm 41. He says, raise me up, set me in your presence. He's casting himself and his hope on God. Then Psalm 51 is about the betrayal of a close companion too, a close friend. I call to God, he'll save me. Cast your burden on the Lord. Cast your betrayal on the Lord. What else can you do? But you know what? That's probably too much of a defeatist way of saying it. Here's a more positive spin. What better thing is there for you to do? Last verse. And I want you to promise me that you'll listen to it or even turn there Matthew 26, when Judas actually shows up there in the garden. I want to begin reading in verse 47. You have to hear this. It is only in the Gospel of Matthew. You cannot find this in Mark, Luke, or John. Only in Matthew, beginning in verse 47. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs, and the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I kiss is the man. Seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," like freshly churned farm butter. And he kissed him, softer than oil. But I come to this passage to show you what Jesus says, how Jesus addresses him. Verse 50. Jesus said to him, "Friend." Friend. Matthew is the only one that records this instance, this wording. Friend. Do what you came to do. And if I had to guess, it probably sounded more like, friend, friend, do what you came to do. Let's get on with it. But when Jesus calls him friend, based on the passages I just showed you this episode, I don't think Christ was being sarcastic. I think he was being legit. And can't you imagine Jesus thinking about Psalm 41 and 55 as they are leading him away in shackles? If this was just my enemies, this wouldn't hurt so bad. But my friend, my close companion? But can't you also imagine him thinking about Psalm 41 and Psalm 55 about casting his cares and casting his hope on God? God, raise me up. Psalm 41. And come Sunday, he did. Come Sunday, he was alive. But come Sunday, his friend was not. A tragedy. Much like Macbeth was. But because he was alive on Sunday, it's why every single person who gets a hold of this episode, whenever you get a hold of it, it's why you should be a Christian. You know that. You know it. But the last thing I want to ask you, we often sing in our churches sometimes, "I'll be a friend to Jesus." But based on this context, I want to ask, what kind? Are you going to be the friend that turns away? And people do that all the time. They're a friend of Jesus in faith. They're a friend of Jesus in obedience, and they fall away. They turn their back. This kind of betrayal didn't just happen in Judas. It still happens. What kind of friend will you be to him? I know the type that he is to you.
There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found something to treasure in your hearts and ponder. The song you've heard is Reckless Love, sung by Praise and Harmony on their album, Resurrecting God. May God's face shine on you always.
Oh God, oh